So basically what happened is Al was like, maybe we should do a podcast. I said, okay. I downloaded some software. I sent him a link and here we are with zero preparation.
Yeah. So in my old age, having had an X account for 15 years, we decided maybe there are two people out there that might want to hear what we have to say. I doubt it,
I
unfortunately.
think the Indians and the Jews really together are unstoppable,
Exactly. Our very mild egos.
which is actually a good first question. The word judgmental in our society is kind of used as a pejorative. It's considered negative. Don't be judgmental and oh my God, and don't be judgy. Whereas I think for me and probably for you, our judgment is one of our strongest traits. So my question is, when you meet the endless number of people who you might want to hire, or a kid who wants to raise some money or has a startup idea, and you're able to size them up like this, what are the things that like instantly sort of turn you off or turn you on in terms of sizing people?
It's a good question. I will say having, I don't know, hired how many people, thousands of people within companies and not to put out there, but having a pretty wide sample set of people across finance, technology, you name it, data science, analytics. I actually still don't believe you can size people up effectively. Even though I feel like I've done it and there's this whole, idea of pattern recognition. And in early stage venture, I actually think it's the same thing. I really do believe, as a perfect example, when we hire people we don't know and we don't have some sort of really high referrals, some sort of, pattern to go on for that specific person, and we make a decision, still it's a 50-50 bet, which I think is what makes venture investing interesting. Because if that was not the case, then I think it'd be pretty easy to figure out how to invest in venture. And even the best venture investors in the world, the top 10 venture firms have outsized returns in early stage investing. Outside of the top 10, it's kind of random. And I think it's because there is no formula that works.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that's a good answer, which I think gets to the next observation that I've had in building my businesses, which is people stuff are by far the hardest part of any business. And I feel like, you have done an amazing job. I've watched you in all these years we've been buddies start business after business after business. And it's just like you're able to build a team so quickly, raise a shit ton of capital, get it going. Sometimes you run it, sometimes you put in a CEO. So whether or not you're calling it a 50-50 sort of,
Isn't it great how from the outside the stew feels like it's very clean when it's made, and the reality is from the inside it's always it's a mess. When we sold my first company, we sold CashNet USA or Enova in late 2006, so 20 years ago. We actually gave some money to the University of Illinois, which you and I have obviously done together since, and we helped start this. I guess now it's called iVenture. At the time, it was called Illini Launch, the Y Combinator kind of offshoot at Illinois. And actually, our best engineers in the early Avant days were folks that I actually found through that program. I think the behavioral aspect of it is much more important than looking at a person and trying to understand their resume. Meaning we were starting a company and we weren't really paying people very much. We were willing to pay people relatively low dollars, but with high equity. The first year of Avant was built in an interior office that kept growing. We had no windows. We had fake windows on the wall that we would kind of put up. We had bad air conditioning. We had these internal air conditioners that would pump the hot air into the ceiling. When we actually raised capital from Tiger Global, one of the biggest investors in the world, they came into that office and Chase Coleman, who runs Tiger, was actually taking pictures of these air conditioners. And I think in his mind, he was like, oh, if these guys are crazy enough to sit with 100 people in 3,500 square feet of interior space with these air conditioners pumping the hot air into the ceiling and work 6 or 7 days a week, why were they willing to join for limited salary and a bunch of equity? I think that's what actually, in my mind, creates better outcomes, because it's a shitty situation. You're not joining a startup because it's going to be cool and you're going to get all this, like fanfare and great lunch. You're joining because you believe in yourself and you think there's going to be a great outcome that you can create.
And the theme that I hear you talking about is self-selection, right?
Yeah.
It's like you put out a certain signal and there's going to be kids who respond to it and sort of people who don't.
But
You and I have done those, like you mentioned, at Illinois. We'll go down there and we host these events, and sometimes we co-invest in these deals with young people. And I think a lot about the self-selection element of it, because for me, one of the things that is a signal is when someone asks me to have coffee sort of like too many times and they're 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and well, I'm still working here, but I have this idea, but I'm not sure. At a certain point you go, well, it's just not for you. Because had it been something that you could not stop yourself from doing, that is sort of like that signal that you're kind of talking about, which is how does someone react under pressure? They take action, and then I, sort of respect that.
Well, so you backed Greg out of college for KeyMe,
Yeah, yeah. Well, out of Columbia, yeah.
out of business school. How did you decide that Greg was the person that you wanted to back, and you've invested with him for how many years? 10 plus
Yeah,
years.
that was in 2012. I was doing some adjunct work at the Columbia Business School in New York, and I had a student named Omar Haroon who has actually gone on to be a super successful entrepreneur in with a few exits. And Omar, even though he had graduated, he liked the rapport that he and I had had. So he called me. He said, "Hey, there's a first year who's really, really smart, and I want you to kind of mentor him." And that was Greg Marsh. And Greg had this idea: "Hey, let's build a phone booth sized robot, that was going to copy your car or your house key, and it'll remember your key, and we're going to disaggregate this multi-billion-dollar locksmith sort of industry." And I said, "Well, okay, are you technical? Like, do you know how to code or something?" And he said no. So I didn't really take it that seriously. But then a few months later, he basically grabbed me and dragged me into this room where him and these guys who, with his own charisma, he had found at Columbia, had built this contraption, and it copied my key successfully. And I basically said, "I'm willing to, be your first investor." But the signal that I wanted to see from them is you have to drop out of Columbia.
You were Peter Thiel
Yeah, except
before the fellowship.
yeah, Indian and much poorer, but yes. But Greg, I think whether or not he met me was gonna drop out, which is the real answer to your question, which is when I saw that this kid was willing to ruin his life, because I think that you need to
Well,
burn the boat.
I think this whole premise of ruining your life and all the risk, I actually think this is one of the reasons entrepreneurs are who they are, is they just perceive risk differently. And in the US, the reality is people love entrepreneurs. There's nothing like someone that tried to build a startup and it failed, and then the next one did better, and you end up with a better story. So I think part of the issue holding back a lot of people is this kind of perception that, okay, if you leave Columbia Business School now and you do a startup, your career is ruined. Which I think is the reality is that outcome is not the case. Even if the startup didn't work, he could go back to business school probably and finish business school. He probably could go get a job at a different startup at a way higher level than he would have otherwise. Like I think people kind of don't, they conflate those issues.
So I think both things are true. When I use the word ruin your life, I mean just because how hard it is, and the degree to which you have to have that persistence, which I think is far higher than, usually people who are comfortable sort of working, 9 to 5. But where I think we are completely unified is exactly what you just said, because Greg has been interviewed, I think, a number of times. Once KeyMe, has raised probably over 100 million in institutional capital. He said, everyone thought it was nuts for me to drop out, but I looked at it as the lowest risk proposition because I knew that I wanted to do this and I would have tremendous regret if I didn't give it a shot. So I'm going to go try. And if it doesn't work after a couple of years, I know I can come back to Columbia and go that path. So I think that you're right, but I do think it still comes back to self-selection, So let me ask you this, because you brought up Avant. And I think around the time that I met you, you had probably just sold your first business and Avant was just kind of getting off the ground. And it was when I was learning to kind of be an investor. I was still building my business, GMM, but the money that I was making, I was stupidly investing in these tech startups. And I started watching you and I'm like, Jesus Christ, these are these hundreds of millions of dollars of financing that you were raising. I remember when we were in our YPO forum together and we went to New York and we met Chase Coleman, I think, at his office, and he was singing your praises. And then over the years, Avant, was like this darling unicorn. And then obviously fintech became very challenged for a number of years. And then
Yeah, you were really cool, and then you totally came down to earth.
which is the question I want to hear from you on, which is on LinkedIn, on, X, people celebrate these funding rounds. Oh my God, so proud to announce we've raised 50 million from X or Y brand name VC. You now have probably raised over $1 billion, I would think, easily in equity from the best VCs in the world. You've seen these VCs when they love you, when they're mad at you, when they're on the table on the board. Like, how do you look at venture funding? And how do you look at the signal and the noise? And how would you recommend young people take your experience, which is vast at this point, and optimize?
Yeah, it's a vast experience, I think is another way of saying like many scars. So you see all the scars,
You're
gray
so
hair,
good looking. You're
the
just so
hiding.
good.
So my own background, having built my first company was Innova, and then Pangea, and then Avant. Innova and Pangea were not venture funded. Innova, we raised 3 million of capital from basically friends and family, extended friends and family. Pangea, we raised more capital than that, about 160 million of capital, but from also high net worth individuals, extended friends and family for real estate investment. So Avant was my first experience with venture, and it was an interesting one because we started in 2013. I had some friends in the venture world that basically told me like, "Hey, do something in venture." I got together with my two former interns, where it's like it seems like you could pull a team out of thin air. The reality is, I basically pulled these two brilliant, perfect SAT kids that were in Y Combinator that I knew really well, and we partnered together. And the initial capital was relatively easy to raise because we got into business because we knew the capital was there. And then fintech got super hot. Early days of fintech lending, there was massive momentum, similar to, I think, what's going on in AI today in a way, where you have this cycle, this Gartner hype cycle, if you will. You have this early success and interest, massive hype and momentum, where lenders, fintechs of all forms, were raising capital at multiples of revenue, not multiples of earnings. And as you think about it, all of a sudden, fintech went through this whole evolution where it went from kind of, okay, we're in the hype cycle. We went through this phase of disillusionment when everyone kind of gave up on fintech and basically said, these companies can't make money. They're not going to be profitable. There's no differentiation or competitive moat. There were hundreds of companies that I was competing with. Today, there are maybe five. And so there was a massive amount of capital that was destroyed in that process. We survived. Avant persevered. We had lots of ups and downs. We had to evolve the business. But today we are 5 times larger than we were the last time we raised capital. We are profitable and scaling, and we've expanded our product base. We're serving millions of customers, and our valuation has come back, but it's come back because of that fact pattern.
My partner and I didn't raise any capital. We built this business to about $100 million in sales, and we built these plants around the world. And it's hard. It's hard. And there's a lot of people see the Pat story like, oh, wow, great. It all worked out. And, your story that you just told, it kind of works out in the story. But what they don't see is behind the scenes, the 1,000 little decisions that kind of went right, or the avoidance of potentially company killing mistakes along the way. And we all hit these obstacles, right? And the question I have for you is that when I hear your story, there's two things that I'm hearing. One, like, oh, well, I just had these two interns and, so I just kind of grabbed them. But the key is that you had the charisma and you had the ability to make those guys believe that this is a train that they should hook their wagon to, so that's one point. And the second point is,
I think I hooked my train to their wagon. That
well,
was more the
exactly.
operative way of doing it.
But I do think that, you're being uncharacteristically humble here, but we know that people don't want to make a losing bet. People will not buy a ticket if they know the boat is the Titanic. And there is some energy, a high energy element that I think a lot of entrepreneurs have that is somehow infectious, where people want to believe that, hey, look, if I'm with this guy, I know he's a winner. I know that I will be able to believe. I think that's one thing that I took from your story. I think the more impressive thing is the perseverance, right? I mean, these things take at least a decade for the most part. My business certainly took 10 years before it got to scale. Fintech was a calamity. So many businesses just completely went under, and you did not. You never stopped. You never stopped sort of fighting. Do you think you can teach that kind of like perseverance? Like, do you think that you can kind of advise somebody, hey, look what I did and you do it too? Or do you think you can't teach those things?
Well, what you're better with the Greek mythology references, but who was the person?
Sisyphus, baby.
Well, not that. That's a different. But the one that found the rock, and then chiseled the rock, and ultimately got to this beautiful statue. And they asked him, "It's like, how did you create this beautiful?"
Oh, yeah. You're talking about when Michelangelo got the flawed piece of Carrara marble, and they said, how did you? He said, David was always inside. They said, how'd you do it? He said, I just took away all the rock that wasn't David.
I just took away all the rock. So, I think you and I both like these random references. I think you learn a lot about the world by understanding history. And the Churchill line about success is one of my favorite, about what is success in the Church of Len is. It's just going from one failure to the next failure without losing your enthusiasm in the process. And I think there is something about perseverance that if you are around long enough, if you don't give up, then you will have chances to be successful. The likelihood of going from a company that's angel funded to a company that raises venture and is potentially an IPO candidate is less than 1%. You know,
Uh,
half
yeah, I would be
right,
amazed if it was even that high.
crazy, right? Half a percent of companies, but those companies obviously get all the valuation, all the money, all the hopes. You have to have a crazy amount of, I don't know, delusion or self-confidence to want to take on that kind of challenge. So to me, it's a different kind of bet. I love the journey. I think you have to really enjoy the journey. Everyone I know that goes into startups and venture and does it because they think this is the best way to make money ends up quitting because it's not. The expected value isn't there. I think you really have to believe that I am going to go after this challenge because I love doing it. I love the journey. To me personally, I'm curious what you think about it.
I think enjoying the process. I mean, if you can call it enjoying, the way I would frame it is I know you and I are both sort of into the whole stoic thing. You obviously your new venture, has the word stoic in its name. And one of the things that I think come from all of those readings as it relates to business is expect the difficulty. There have been so many times, both as an operator when I was building my business, as well as now, I've done, probably 15 venture deals and I'm on these boards and I'm constantly talking to these new entrepreneurs and hearing what's going on in their day-to-day life. And one of my biggest values now that I'm, in my early 50s and I'm talking to these kids who can be some cases mid 20s or 30s is when something horrible happens, they get served with that lawsuit or, the key person quits or there's a marriage problem or something with their kid or just something terrible as it relates to the narrative of the business, it is to say, okay, even if you are a victim here, don't act like one. Like, understand that this is the game that you've signed up for. And just the framing of it, I found it to be so valuable where it's like, okay, fine, this is now the problem that I'm going to solve. Like
Yeah.
Musk, I love listening to all his podcasts because he's like, all I do is triage. I just go and I try to find the biggest problem and then I work on that. And I definitely think framing is one of those things that allows you to be the 0.5% because it allows you to keep going when so many people just give up.
Well, it's like the 8-year overnight success. It's this company was in there toiling, trying to survive. Nobody cared, and then all of a sudden it hits. You're like, oh my god, it's the greatest thing ever. But they were in there fighting every day.
Oh,
Did you ever hear Musk? I think it was at one of the all in conversations where he was talking about how even at this point, 60% of what he does every day he hates and it's administrative and he still has to do it because it's a job. But then 40% he loves. And to me, that was most interesting. I actually played it for the kids because even Musk, the most successful entrepreneur in history, first trillionaire, soon to be trillionaire in the history of the world, still 60% of what he has to do every day.
it's probably just become second nature for him because he's like, this is part of the process. So I just don't question it. Like, this is what you kind of have to do. Since you brought up the kids and modeling good behavior, and obviously our wives are very close friends and we've traveled a bunch and the kids all know each other, and you and I are both kind of over obsessed with like making sure our kids aren't spoiled and entitled and doing all the things that we think. I played for them Jensen Huang, who was on Rogan the other day,
Yeah, it was great actually.
and he talked at the end about his background. I had no idea. Like, it was insane. He's like, yeah,
Getting shipped to America at age 9.
yeah. And he's like, I was in this dorm. My roommate was 17 years old, and I was going to this public school down the street, and I smoked because everyone smoked at age 9. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, yeah, but it wasn't that bad. It was fine. And, I had my brother and he told this story, but I played it for the kids because, one of the things that I think you and I have spoken about is, the biggest advantage that you cannot give your children are the disadvantages you grew up with. And, sort of like my parents were immigrants. I was born in Waukegan, which is a very blue collar town. But you were what, 8 when you got here?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was not easy. You didn't speak English.
No. No. I
Okay.
still barely speak. So
Yeah, but I mean, you're
I'm
quoting,
working on it.
Michelangelo. And so, you become quite the
I'm
warrior
working on it.
poet. But, do you believe that? Do you believe that the advantages or the disadvantages you had, A, were they instrumental in your success? And B, do you think that either you or I can manufacture obstacles as we're trying to do for our own kids to try to replicate that?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I listened to Jensen also, and there were a couple things in his story that were just so interesting. It's like, I think that's the challenge is as a kid growing up as an immigrant kid with no money, and my wife, also immigrant, came at 13, didn't speak the language and had to learn. Her dad, brilliant mathematician from the Soviet Union, didn't speak a word of English. He's already in his 60s when they came to the US, had no idea what her and her brother were doing, and yet they both had to figure it out. I think our kids, they have guardrails. They are very fortunate that your kids, our kids, they have
You
two
could say
parents,
that.
right? Two parents that love them and take care of them, probably too much. And so I think that that's a disadvantage against kids who come up without that, who just have so much eagerness to win, to be successful. And I think that's the balance of life. It's kind of interesting is we can help our kids with tutors and sports coaches and all those kind of things. But in the real world, they're going to have to go and compete against the best and brightest in the world that want to win at such a high degree. And so that's what I try to tell the kids. Is like, look, life is sort of equalizing. Once you get into the real world, there are no accommodations. There really is no help. It's all about the fittest survive. You have to create a mindset that allows you to overcome those challenges, and that's really hard.
Well, and one of the things that I think you and I both into is narrative, right? I mean, building our businesses, whether it's raising capital, you have to tell a very good story. If you are trying to communicate to your kids, you have to tell a very good story. And I think that something that you and I have both tried to do is to inculcate in these kids, this is the story of your family. This is where your grandparents came from. This is where your parents came from, and here's where you are. And I feel that, the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility, is so crucial. The responsibility that you have, work your freaking ass off, because that is like the only currency that you are going to have to differentiate yourself. No one is going to care in 10 or 20 years who their parents is. They literally are not going to care. They're going to care about what does that kid evoke in them emotionally? How smart are they? And I think that's it.
Do you think it's working?
I don't know. Look, I think we're all pretty lucky in the sense that our kids so far are, I know your kids pretty well, and my kids seem to be doing a pretty good job. But I think what we're, between Anna and Sonal and us, I think what we're trying to do is when the kids come up to us and start whining about whatever, it's like, I just turn to stone in a sense. It's like, figure it out. Like, figure it out. Do not tell me that that is a problem. Like, these phones and the social media, it is such a dopamine machine, and it's so easy for kids to just, whine about things and have someone solve their problem. So I try as much as possible to create authentic little battles for them to solve.
So I have this view that maybe at some point we could write this book together. I read this book, The Rational Optimist. I made the kids listen to it in audio form on one of our ski trips. And the book goes through history of humanity and talking about how today's world is the best world in the history of the world by far in terms of every metric. Less starvation, despite what we read in the news and hear in the news, is less starvation, less death, less disease, less poverty across every metric. And it talks about how over time that's going to continue to improve. I think I have this view more of a cynical optimist, which basically means that most things don't work. Most things in the world end up failing and have bad narrative. And despite that, you have to continue to be happy. You're not going to have a perfect experience with every teacher. You might lose this basketball game, but your job is to still be happy, to be optimistic about this experience that we all get to share, this one in a quadrillion opportunity that we have to be alive in this day and age, and just work towards positive success. And I think that's such a hard mindset, is that be optimistic in the face of things that don't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very well said. We have a little family chat, with the four of us, and I always put these sort of sometimes cliched, but whatever. I mean, they're cliches for a reason, and I'll cut and paste a bunch of stuff and stick it in there, and hope that the kids on their one phone and one watch will look at it. And I put this content in there, and it was about JFK, John F. Kennedy, and it talked about how when he was a teenager, he had these journals, which have only recently come to light, and how this kid, JFK, who was raised by effectively one of the richest people in America at the time, Joe Kennedy, they were billionaires. And in his spare time, he was writing these essays in his journals about foreign affairs and about America's place in the world and Hitler and the rise of fascism. And you go, I think that there's a reason why America fell in love with him because, yes, he had this super privileged lifestyle. But on the flip side, despite all of those things, the guy was a voracious reader. He was constantly intellectually curious. He was learning about the world. And I try to tell my kids, don't worry about like what anyone thinks or your background. Were you poor? Were you rich? Were you anything? People will judge you for who you are.
Well, I'll tell you. So with Stoic Lane, obviously, we talked about Stoic from the very beginning when it was more of an idea. So the original idea for Stoic is it's a holding company based on Buffett and Munger where it compounds capital. And so we had this concept of, okay, where do we want to go? Let's go where all the venture dollars are not flowing. Because I've seen what happens when you have too much money flowing into a category, right? The old line, like money is the enemy of returns. So we had this idea, okay, let's go to these old line industries where we could buy companies for 5 times cash flow. And so we went to some of these old line industries that were highly fragmented. And we kind of said, okay, we're going to do tech-enabled roll-ups. Lo and behold, in 2025, the term AI roll-up is here. All these venture firms have now decided that with the benefit of AI, they can go and compete with us in every industry that we're in. So Stoic Lane has 4 businesses, all in financial services, real estate services. So we have vacation rental property management. We have the second largest platform in that space. We have an accounting roll-up. We have a top 65 accounting firm that we've created. We've bought 41 accounting firms now. We have a business in real estate appraisal and valuation services. And then we have a payroll and benefits business. We have venture-backed competitors in every one of those spaces now.
And see, and AI is a theme, right? That enabled a lot of that, right? Because now you guys are obviously building at scale. When we talk about AI, I'll tell you what amazes me. I was on a trip recently with some good friends and we got into this long, cocktails and wine and late night and somehow AI comes up. And it was amazing to me how some folks are so negative, like literally like the term AI doomer. All the capital is going to accrue with the people who have the humanoids and it's not going to be for the regular working people. And I was just listening to it. And I said, at the turn of the 20th century, everyone worked in freaking agriculture in America. And if you would have told them. And so I just think that one of the things that I like to, as cynical as I can be, is you have to be a hyper optimist if you're going to be successful at anything. Like you have to put those two thoughts in your mind at the same time. Understand that you're doing something that there's a 1% successful rate, but on the flip side, you have to be super irrationally optimistic.
I'll tell you my cynical, optimistic view is I do think the transition is going to be challenging. So yesterday, perfect example. So I spent half the day with one of our top engineers and we were digging in and he was showing me the way he's writing code these days. And literally, basically, he is writing prompts and these prompts are effectively code, but it's an abstraction of code where he can produce himself
natural language.
Well, natural language, but it's very detailed. It's not like what we think of it as a ChatGPT prompt where create this cool meme of, Musk flying in a plane or something. It's very, very detailed based on the data. There's scripts that create this code, but at the same time, he can then produce as much code by himself in one day as it would take us a team of engineers to produce in weeks, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. And then the question becomes, what is the value add? And I think the value add is knowing what good looks like, being a senior engineer, being able to prompt correctly. The transition from kind of not being able to grind it out as a junior engineer to senior engineer is going to be really challenging. But at the end of the day, we're going to figure it out. I'm pretty optimistic we're going to figure it out. I think we're going to enter an age of abundance, sort of the Musk idea of we're not going to have to work. I don't know if we're going to get all the way there. I do think there are going to be societal challenges with that, where if people don't have to work,
what's your purpose?
And humanity has derived purpose from having to work for millennia, that transition could be quite challenging.
So I remember when I met Rahm Emanuel, it was at some event years ago. And then one of his fundraiser, one of his people reached out to me and said, "Hey, the mayor would like to have one-on-one lunch with you." I said, "Oh, awesome." Right. Because Rahm was, I supported him. So when I went to the lunch with him and he said, I like some of the things you were saying. You were talking to someone next to me, but I heard it and it resonated with me. I said, "Well, what was that?" He said, "You said the only recipe to be happy is to be working your ass off on something." And he said, "That's exactly how I see it. That's how my brothers see it." And I think that's my answer to your question, which is when you remove the economic boot upon people's neck, where they need to make the mortgage and they need to, pay the school, I think it will be an existential crisis to a certain extent to find that purpose. And I think that the more that you can train your kids or in the schools to, err to taking action. Number one, don't sit around and just like speculate. So take some action. Don't be afraid to try a whole bunch of things because eventually you will figure out that you like to do X, Y, or Z. Years ago, after I sold my business, I had this hobby. I wanted to make a movie. So I'd never done it. I just went off and I made a movie.
By the way, as much as we wanted to make fun of you, it was actually a very good movie.
And just for anyone who goes and watches a movie called 100 Days to Live, you can see my boy here, Al, in the background in one of the restaurant scenes. But the point I'm making is whether or not it's film, whether or not it's photography, whether or not it's, CrossFit, I just encourage everybody who is getting to this phase of life where they have resources and they have time, don't stop being curious about learning new things. Like, I think it keeps your brain absolutely vital when you are learning. And then when you can particularly translate that learning into action. I think that is like the way I want to live.
Well, I do believe, again, we talk about Buffett a little bit and Munger. I'm a huge fan of what they've accomplished. Amazingly, Charlie Munger died a year and a half ago at age 99. And he was giving speeches at age 99. Buffett is 93?
Yeah.
About to be 94. And he's totally coherent. And yes, it could be a medical anomaly at that age. Maybe, modern medicine is advancing it. But I think there are very few people, if you look at the odds of two business partners that have worked together for that many years, both being able to operate at that level in their 90s, the percentage likelihood has got to be incredibly low. And I think a big part of it is they the whole time, and for them, work was a passion. They enjoyed learning. They're constantly stimulating and constantly hanging out with younger people who are pushing them. And so, I think more people need to be in a position to actually do that.
Well, I mean, I worship Buffett and Munger, and I've read every one of those Berkshire Hathaway letters, and Poor Charlie's Almanac is the collection of all the Munger speeches, which I also highly
I actually was telling Jason, who I was hanging out with yesterday, I told him he's got to read Poor Charlie's Almanac and then Poor Richard's Almanac. That's Benjamin Franklin's book that Poor Charlie's Almanac is based on.
I just have a lot of thoughts to what you just said. A, read biographies. So Isaacson wrote about Franklin as he wrote about Musk. There's many billion-dollar ideas in biographies. A. B, Buffett and Munger both famously said, I tap dance to work every day. Like, I don't feel like it's work, which provides this vitality. The third thing that I've noticed looking at those guys is, Buffett and Munger both would say, my calendar's empty. I sit around and I read. If I want to talk to someone, I'll call them. If there's an urgent thing, yes, I'm reachable. But generally, I stare out the window a lot. And I think the lesson is do not confuse activity and progress, because there's a lot of people that are just harried and they're frenetic and they're just like, they define themselves by their inability to manage their life. And usually those people don't get very far. Whereas if you actually know what you're doing and you know why you're doing what you're doing, I think that you can get to the heart of the matter a lot faster.
I have one final note just in response to your earlier comment about Ram. Ram recently was tweeting, at least I saw it on X, about the new Australian rule against social media and cell phones for kids under 16.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you saw it. I actually think, and Florida is doing something very similar. I actually think he is totally right about that. As we think about our discussion about ultimately what do we want our kids to be able to do, I think technology is such a hindrance for development because it just sucks so much time. It's this idea of for all of us, I think it can pull you in to this world where all you do, you're just, looking at little short videos of cats, or in my kids' case, I don't know, basketball content, but it's not productive. You're not learning. You're not expanding. And I think your attention span suffers dramatically. And so to me, Ram is totally right. I could 100% support that initiative that he's trying to push.
I mean, short form video content could be the worst thing to conceivably happen to this entire generation of kids, because it absolutely hijacks their attention span. And I think the biggest tragedy is if you actually, my business partner that I built GMM with is a Cantonese guy from Hong Kong. And, I've been to China probably 50 times. And, we had hundreds of employees in our plants in China. And a lot of our people spoke good English and they were Westernized. And so I got to know their kids. The delta between TikTok, okay, the Chinese version of TikTok.
Oh yeah, learn math. Yeah.
not what you see here. It is insane. And it's like, if there is a Trojan horse that they are trying to just inject the plague into this country, it's that. It's like, I look at TikTok in America, it's like, it's hell. It's just hell. But it's so intoxicating because the algorithm's so good. So I just deleted it off my phone. But in China, they are like getting stronger with that content.
Yeah. Math and science in short form video.
Yeah, I'll send you a file. I don't know how this is going to get formatted or whatever, but I'll shoot it to you.
All right, man.
All right, later.